Good afternoon. I am grateful to be speaking to you from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Esquimalt and the Songhees Nations. I am Rob Flemming, the Minister of Education for the province of British Columbia, and I have here with me today BC's Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, who needs no introduction, and Stephanie Higginson, who is the President of the BC School Trustees Association, as well remotely from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nations. We have Andrea Sinclair, who's President of the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Councils. I want to begin by saying that I hope families are having a wonderful, well-deserved break. Students and educators and everyone who's had a very busy school year that we've just concluded in June. I also want to recognize today, and this is why we're making today's announcement, that there are some who are feeling anxious about what school might look like in September. This is why, throughout the pandemic, we've been working closely with teachers, parents, support workers, principals and vice principals, superintendents, trustees, and Indigenous rights holders to ensure that health and safety in BC schools remain paramount. You'll recall that early in the pandemic, the Ministry of Education issued a 5-stage approach that would allow in-class instruction to be adjusted depending on the risk of transmission and the direction that we received from public health authorities. During the March break, schools were in Stage 5, which featured the suspension of all in-class learning in British Columbia. After the March break, we moved to Stage 4, which meant that and allowed for 5,000 children of essential service workers who needed extra support in school to be accommodated in the classroom. During this period, we saw families and school communities really step up in heroic ways to provide essential services to our students. More than 75,000 meals were delivered each and every week to tens of thousands of families across the province. 23,000 technology devices and computers were loaned and arranged for students throughout the province to stay connected as we move to online remote learning. In June, we were able to do something different. Because of British Columbia's collective efforts to flatten the curve, we moved to Stage 3, which was an optional voluntary return to class. And 200,000 students safely returned to school and attended mostly on a part-time basis schools right across British Columbia. Today, we are announcing that on September 8th for the next school year, we are moving to Stage 2 of BC's Education Restart Plan. Stage 2 will see most students returning to the classroom full-time, with new and enhanced health and safety guidelines co-created with the Provincial Health Officer, the BC Centre for Disease Control, and public health experts who have so steadily guided our province throughout the pandemic. We also have an education steering committee in the Ministry of Education with membership from all education partners, parents, teachers, and staff who are working hard to help us with these new guidelines and to ensure that students can safely return to school in September. The committee's work will continue to meet throughout the summer, collaboratively developing plans and providing solutions to any challenges that may arise before the new school year begins. I will say more about this and what it will mean for families, students, and staff in a few moments, but first I'd like to welcome BC's Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, who will walk you through the newly updated health and safety guidelines that will ensure schools are as safe as possible when we take this next step in BC's Education Restart Plan. Dr. Henry.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. As Minister Flemming has said, much work has been done in recent weeks to put those pieces together that will allow all students and teachers, as much as possible, to safely get back to in-class learning this September. This has not been an easy task, and it has been something that has been front of mind since the very beginning of this pandemic. When we suspended in-class teaching, the very first thing we discussed was the need to get children back into those important learning environments as soon as we could safely. We have been working together on the plan since that time. It is a robust plan that I believe puts the health and safety of our children, teachers, and staff at the top of our list of requirements. While we are still in the middle of school summer holidays, I know lots of people, families out there, students and staff, are eager to get back to school this fall, and I hear from many of you on an often daily basis. For students, being in class is about learning, about seeing friends, about getting those important emotional and social supports, as well as an important education. Being back in school is also crucial for the many parents and families to be able to work and to be able to cope with dealing with this pandemic as a community. We know that schools can safely reopen if community transmission is low. And even though we've had an uptick in the last few weeks, we know that we have flattened the curve here in BC, and we know we have what it takes to continue to keep our transmission rates low. And we've taken the measures that we needed to make sure that when we do see cases arise, we adjust our requirements to stop the transmission in those particular places. And that is working. We're seeing that now. A key aspect of a full return to school are what we've created, cohorts, or what we're calling learning groups, that will be created for every school across the province. The principle behind these learning groups is to create groups of students and staff who will remain together throughout the school year or term and who primarily interact only with each other. By creating these learning groups, students and staff within each group will be able to safely spend time together, maintaining distance as much as possible throughout the school year. And while they may not be in the same classroom, learning groups will be able to connect with each other during breaks in common areas and places like the playground, the gym, or the library, other important learning environments in the school. It also means that in the event of a case of COVID-19 in the school, the potential for transmission will be limited, and the ability for public health to quickly complete contact tracing will be far easier and far less disruptive. It also, to set the learning group size, the team that's been working on this started with 2 times the typical number of students in a classroom. So for elementary and middle school, each learning group will have at most about 60 people. And that seems like a lot. That's not all in the same classroom. But it will be segregating by grades so that there's less mingling in the school environment. For secondary school, it will be up to 120 people. And again, that's a maximum, and that doesn't mean that you will have contact with all of those people every day. It means that that is the bubble, if we will, or the learning group that will be used. Learning groups are smaller in the elementary and middle schools because it's more challenging, as we know, for younger students to maintain that safe physical distance. So we want to reduce the number of people and focus on reducing physical contact between students. Older students are also much better able to practice hand hygiene and recognize if they're experiencing symptoms of COVID-19. And as we know from the data, younger children are much less likely to get infected with COVID-19 or to pass it on to others, whereas older children are much more like young adults, where they often do not get severe infection, but they are able to pass it on to each other, so we need to be more careful in those groups. Looking to September, school is going to look and feel different. The learning groups is one example, but so are additional measures that we will need to take and learning from what we experienced in June. So additional measures around cleaning, movement within the school, social interactions, and how they can be done safely in the school environment. The foundational rules for safe social interactions will apply in our schools as well. And that includes hand hygiene, washing hands regularly, maintaining a safe physical distance, both inside as much as possible, but in particular with those outside of your learning group, using a mask if you choose, particularly in those areas where the distance cannot be maintained. And we're talking about places like on the school buses or in hallways. And incredibly important for students, staff, and educators, staying home if you're sick. I know for many students and staff, being in the classroom is where they want to be and where they need to be. We know there are unintended negative consequences when children are not in school for a period of time. Ensuring a full return to school is done as safely as possible is my priority and the priority of the public health officers across the province. We are your school health officers, and we will be there with you through the fall. I have a great deal of confidence that this plan has been put in place will make that happen. When September comes, I ask families, employers, to please continue to be flexible. One thing we have learned from this pandemic is we cannot predict the future. We are planning for a number of scenarios, and if we start to see community transmission that puts this at a risk, we will need to adjust the school schedule as well. There has been a lot of thought and consideration to reopening schools this fall, but as we have done since the start of COVID-19, we'll need to continue to learn and adapt as we go. We do know that cases may occur, and we in public health, the school health officers, will be there and will support the school community to manage any case that does arise and make sure that we can control the spread, as we do with many other communicable diseases that are often in our school system. And we learned about this in June. We learned how to do that, and we know that we can do it safely and efficiently. This new approach and the measures we have in place are not forever, but they are going to be for the coming school year. I do also think it gives us an important opportunity for innovation and for engaging with students across our school system and how we can manage together through this pandemic. We will be monitoring schools closely and ready to step in with any necessary support for the entire school community as needed. This is something all of us in public health take very seriously. We also recognize the importance of schools as a learning environment for our children and our future. This is about moving forward in a way that we can all feel good about and doing it in a way that is safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henry, and as always, we appreciate your steady and thoughtful leadership and all the hard work that you and your team have done to develop the revised K-12 setting health and safety guidelines, and we want to thank you as well for the frontline healthcare workers who've been doing all they can under your leadership to ensure that BCers are safe and that students can safely return to school in September. We know that 2020 has been an incredibly stressful, challenging year for families. Lives have been disrupted. We've adapted to a new reality. Employment uncertainty is a feature of many families' lives in British Columbia. We had students and families working within new, unknown remote learning environments that we had to create out of thin air. Our priority as we have moved forward through the stages that I've mentioned previously continues to be delivering quality education while protecting the health and safety of students and staff. As I mentioned earlier, we're fortunate that here in BC we have a collaborative approach in education that has served us well since the beginning of this pandemic. Our public health leaders have kept British Columbians safe and COVID transmission very low. And that allowed us to be one of the only jurisdiction in Canada and one of the few in North America to successfully bring back students into a classroom province-wide before the last school year ended. We had nearly 200,000 students attend school in June, and this has given us, as Dr. Henry just mentioned, some very important information as we prepare for September 8th. We've surveyed parents and students recently, and guardians, and the students were in the grade 10 to 12 cohort. 74% of them told us they felt good about the June restart. We know there's a lot more work to do for September 8th. This is what this announcement is about today in terms of giving that direction and allowing for that localized planning and work to be done. But a huge thank you goes out to all the dedicated professionals, the teachers, the support staff, the principals and vice principals, everybody who worked at an exhausting pace through the last school year to be able to communicate with families, to keep kids engaged. Everybody who works in education in our system really, really stepped up. But while educators did a tremendous job to keep kids learning throughout the spring and the early summer, we do know that there's no substitute for in-class learning. And I heard that time and time again from parents, that students and teachers, when they had the chance to reconnect in June, that those in-person connections meant a great deal to students and families and teachers. There's so many young people who need and benefit from a school setting. And some did return to school, as I mentioned, 200,000 students, but many did not. And some of those students will have been out of school, out of a classroom setting for 175 days by the time September 8th rolls around. That's what's informing our desire to safely restart schools with 100% instruction, in-class instruction in elementary and middle schools. Kids thrive when they're with their teachers and with their peers. It's vital for their social and academic development and their mental health and wellness. The lesson of this pandemic is that we must continually adapt to the latest public health advice and science until we have a vaccine. To resource the newly updated health and safety guidelines in place, which are being released today, which Dr. Henry has just described, the province of British Columbia is providing an additional $45.6 million for the school system to enhance cleaning regimes, to hire more cleaning staff, to add more hand washing stations, and to provide reusable face masks to teachers and students that will be stocked for everyone and available on request as a feature of the 2020-21 school year. This also includes $3 million to support remote learning so students can have access to technologies again as they did in the last school year. This will also provide funds that will be made available for kids with disabilities or those with complex learning needs to provide software and other devices to support their learning. As Dr. Henry mentioned, we are maximizing the number of students who can return to class by organizing students and staff into consistent groups called cohorts or learning groups. These learning groups will be no more than 60 people in elementary and middle schools and no more than 120 people in secondary schools. As Dr. Henry mentioned again, the learning groups are smaller for elementary students because it's more challenging for younger children to maintain physical distance from each other, while older students are better able to minimize physical contact and practice hand hygiene and understand if they're experiencing any symptoms of COVID-19. Students in a learning group is distinct from students in a class. They will be able to interact and connect with each other as a consistent group during breaks in common areas like the gym or at the library, at playgrounds, or on school buses. Limiting the number of people each student or staff member comes into contact with will reduce the risk of transmission and will ensure better contact tracing by health authorities. As Dr. Henry has said, masks are not mandatory at this time. It's a personal choice. It will be required in some situations. She's spoken to that. It will be recommended in other situations where physical distancing can't be maintained, but it will be provided by the province of British Columbia through our school authorities. We know some people have concerns, and that's why we're ensuring that reusable masks are available upon request with this additional funding. When it comes to organizing these learning groups, BC is a diverse province. We know that September 8th is going to look differently in different parts of the province. As Dr. Henry has advised us with her team, bell schedules and timetables may need to be adjusted depending on school populations and class configurations. Each school district will plan for their local needs as well as their school populations or space available in their buildings. There are some more densely populated urban areas in our province where secondary schools are large and it may not be possible to have people stay in their learning group while physically distancing on a full-time basis. Specifically, there are about 16 very large schools, primarily in the Lower Mainland, but including Kelowna and Okanagan, that have between 1,500 and 2,000 students. And for these schools, districts are looking at a variety of options to maximize in-class learning for their students, and in some cases they may need to offer a hybrid approach that we became familiar with for their students, with a blend of remote, online, and self-directed learning. But it's important to me as the Education Minister that we, in these uncertain times, continue to support every young person who's made plans for their life, who have dreams to pursue careers in higher education, that they won't be forgotten because of the pandemic, that they will be supported to take the courses they need to pursue their dreams. As September 8th approaches, we want staff, students, and their families to feel confident knowing that we're doing everything possible to ensure their health and safety is paramount, just as we have from the beginning. Families will be updated by school districts throughout the summer about how they're implementing their health and safety guidelines, as well as how they're organizing learning groups, bell schedules, enrollment and registration, and all this information must be posted online by school districts by no later than August 26th. As always, our government will also continue to keep you updated and informed as things progress. I am incredibly grateful for the exceptional team of dedicated education professionals supporting BC students during these challenging times. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone for your continued flexibility and patience as we get ready to safely welcome most students back in the classroom full-time. And I'd like to thank for her role during these times. Stephanie Higginson, the president of the BC School Trustees Association, who leads a diverse organization of over 300 elected officials who co-govern the education system with the province of British Columbia, who's done an incredible job, and will present on behalf of our organization now. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Minister. Ait Squale, Aikwana Silam Namu, and Tapa Stephanie Higginson, Sahit Sanas Nunemo. I'm grateful to be talking to you from the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. And I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude for the hard work that is being done by the Provincial Health Office in British Columbia. Their guidance through this global pandemic allowed BC to be the only jurisdiction in Canada to open classrooms province-wide and allow students to return to school in June, laying the groundwork for this September. And I have to say, as a parent who saw the immediate impact on my 9-year-old when he came home from school that first day, it was a very, very good day in our family. I'm also thankful for the clear direction and collaborative work being done by the Provincial Health Office, the Ministry of Education, and the numerous education employee groups, stakeholders, rights holders, boards of education in developing the K-12 Restart Plan that the Minister and Dr. Henry have talked about today. Boards of education have always understood the important role that public education plays in the well-being of children and society. This pandemic has put a spotlight on this critical service that extends beyond just the delivery of curriculum. And we understand that there is no substitute for in-class instruction. The impact the suspension of in-school learning had on all students and families, but in particular the most vulnerable students, became clear as the weeks away from school turned into months. Boards of education will now take these guidelines, as well as the funds provided by the ministry, thank you very much, to ensure that the students are in school for as much time as is safely possible. The use of learning groups will provide a safer environment for staff and students while allowing more students to be in school for longer periods of time, which we know is critical in their social, emotional, and academic well-being and development. The work ahead is going to require support from every corner of the education sector, and we will all pull together as we have been doing since March. It's going to require new and different scheduling at all school levels, as well as deep and thoughtful planning within individual schools and across school districts. It's also going to require patience from families while your local boards of education work to safely implement this new collective normal. Thanks to the rapid and compassionate response of everyone in this sector from March through June, I am confident that we are up to the challenge. It will look different, it will feel different. And all of us who intersect with the education sector, including staff, students, parents, and communities, must continue to be adaptive, flexible, responsive, patient, and kind as we learn to live with and plan for the duration of this pandemic. In the words of a very wise British Columbian, this new way of doing things is not forever, but it is for now. With the information presented today, we now have a clear path forward that allows local boards of education to begin their planning for September. We are fully focused on creating the best and safest schools for students, staff, families, and communities moving forward. Families can expect updates from their school districts about the new health and safety guidelines, as well as examples of school schedules, along with enrollment and registration information by August 26th. Using the lessons learned from June, together with these updated provincial health and safety guidelines, I am confident that we can create the best and safest learning environments possible for BC students, where they can continue to learn and grow as we navigate this situation together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and I would like to trust in technology now and go to Andrea Sinclair, President of the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Councils, and ask her to say a few words.
Thank you, Minister Flemming. I acknowledge I'm speaking here today on the unceded territories of the Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam Nations. I'm Andrea Sinclair, and I'm president of the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Councils. BC CPAC is the provincially mandated voice representing parents of over 565,000 children attending public schools. I'm a parent myself with 2 children attending high school in Vancouver School District 39. I wish to thank our dedicated board and CEO who have been attending the Education Restart Steering Committee and Subcommittee meetings and working diligently on behalf of our members and families to ensure the parent voice and perspective is heard and represented, and to ensure that equity, inclusion, health and safety, and educational programming remain at the forefront in the planning for a return to school in September. I appreciate that the government and the PHO have listened to parents. Parents should feel assured that as things progress over the coming weeks, the Ministry of Education will be working directly with BC CPAC and all our education partners to ensure that safety remains a top priority. There is no substitute for in-class learning, as I believe we've now all said. We know it's key to children's social, mental, and academic development, and it's why it's very important we get children back into their classrooms. Developing cohorts or learning groups allows for our children to return to a safe environment on a full-time basis. Research tells us that school closures disrupt the learning process and the long-term outcomes of students. The adverse effects go beyond learning loss and include implications like food insecurity or loss of access to health services that can be potentially harmful for students. We greatly appreciate and thank families for all the input they provided through the ministry's survey over the last few weeks. This survey data was reviewed and became part of the conversations and the planning. The majority of parents who responded want children to return to their classrooms. Overall, the majority of BC parents found it incredibly difficult to support their children academically while working from home full-time, and this was especially true for parents of children with special needs and younger students. Parents and guardians want their children to go back to school, a more consistent approach to remote learning if it's required, and they remind us of the challenges faced by working parents. I know these challenges firsthand as I have 2 children in high school, and they will be going back into their grade 11 classrooms in September. I truly appreciate the organization and collaboration created by the Ministry of Education. BC CPAC, along with the ministry, will continue to keep families informed as we get closer to the start of school. Families will hear directly from their school districts by no later than August 26. I recognize that parents have concerns about returning to school in September. We are all worried and we are all concerned for the safety of our children. But we need to be patient and we need to demonstrate kindness. School will indeed look different in the fall. But I believe the spirit of In It Together will continue to ensure the new school year provides all our students the educational opportunities for success. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. And with that, that ends the formal announcement, and we'll go to questions from the media.
Great, thank you, Minister. As a reminder to everybody on the phone line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You are limited to 1 question and 1 follow-up only. Please also take your phones off mute. You will not be audible until I call your name. First question is from Rob Shaw, Vancouver Sun.
Oh, hi. I guess the most obvious question here is that the BCTF has put out a press release saying they do not agree with this plan. It needs a lot more work. It's too much too soon, and they're sort of directly disputing both you, Dr. Henry, and you, Minister Flemming, on this. Were they not included in these consultations you mentioned about? Did you not get their buy-in on this, or how have we got you, on the one hand, telling parents this is safe, and the teachers, on the other hand, saying this is the wrong plan?
Look, I understand the role of the BC Teachers Federation in regard to their members, and I value the BCTF, its president, Terry Mooring, for all of the hard work they've done in collaboration with our ministry. They are indeed a critical part of our Education Restart Steering Committee. About 25 professional teachers sit on the working groups of our Restart plan. And I understand, and it's okay, that not all of them are quite there yet. We had a lot of discussions, similar concerns when we went to stage 3 of the Restart plan. We will get there. She has my commitment that we will continue to collaborate with her organization. Look, professional teachers are vital to making sure that these health and safety protocols are effective to keeping her members safe, to keeping students safe, but also to make sure that we can move back to in-class instruction so that kids can resume their learning careers successfully. I know that they have a professional commitment and compassion for their students. They want to see them succeed. They've shown concern throughout this pandemic for the well-being of students, and they're a critical role at the table, and their input is valued, and I expect that will continue to be something that's directly relayed to me and to all of our education stakeholders.
Do you have a follow-up, Rob?
Sure, I guess. Dr. Henry, you mentioned when we were reopening parts of the economy that you expected to see more cases just because there are more people expanding their bubbles and out there doing things. Does that extend to the school plan? Do we expect to see more cases amongst children? How many cases are going to be okay? Where is the threshold that you will be using as we roll this out to determine not just, when the daily numbers go up and people might start to wonder about those, but in the long term, how we determine how many more cases are going to be acceptable as schools reopen?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily expect there to be cases in schools. I think it's inevitable. There probably will be some, but that's not the biggest concern. As we say, it's more as we're opening up society and having more contacts. So that's why we have to find that balance. So this plan is very similar to how we have managed all along, trying to keep numbers small and manageable. So we minimize the potential for transmission, and we also maximize our ability to efficiently find people and make sure that the transmission chains are stopped. So there's no magic number. We did have some experience where there were mostly adults, and we know that it's mostly adults that bring it into a school situation. So we'll make sure that those encounters are done safely. But we've managed that. And there was not transmission to students. There was not transmission widely in any school setting in BC. So we've had a little bit of practice with that, and we will be working very closely with the schools into September and through the fall and winter. I will say as well that there's no specific magic number. As we've said all along, it's a balancing of the numbers of contacts and the safe contacts, so keeping safe distances, making sure that if we can't, that we're wearing a mask, having our layers of protection in place. And that's what will get us through the school year as well. I'm much more concerned about if we have cases that are popping up that aren't connected. Right now, we do have an increased number of cases, but we're able to link most of them to exposure events that we've had in our community, and I expect that will continue. But I will say as well, it is the fact that everybody in BC has done that, has taken this seriously, has made our community transmission rates very low, that reaffirms how safe it is to start things like the important in-classroom instruction that we have for our young people. And we can't say this enough. We have monitored the unintended negative consequences of a number of the measures that we've put in place in BC, and closing of schools has consequences that can be lifelong for some children. We know that children who have fallen behind may never make up. Both the economic and the educational impacts of that for them and for their families and their communities can last for many, many years. We know that there's been an increase in anxiety, there's been an increase in mental health issues with young people, the number of people calling Children Helpline, the families that have had challenges in managing with children at home. We need, schools are essential to our, not only our economy, but to our society and our community. And this is our safest way that we can move forward.
Next question is from Richard Sussman, Global News.
One of the concerns raised by the BCTF and many parents is around this idea of physical distancing. So will there still be thought given to smaller classrooms, and how possibly can kids ensure distance in the existing infrastructure?
Yeah, so there are many different ways of doing that, and each school district might be slightly different depending on the physical structure and the numbers of students. But yes, we are focusing, as we did in June and as we are in other settings, on the younger children, not physical contact. So stopping physical contact. The concept of 1 meter or 2 meters is something that young children are not that good at figuring out, but they do understand the concept of, keeping my germs to myself, not touching my friend. So those are the concepts that we're working with. Older children, of course, our young people are able to maintain their physical distancing, are able to recognize when they're in those situations where they need to wear a mask, for example. So there will be combinations depending on the physical layout of the school and the age and the numbers of children that are in each of the classrooms and the educators in the classroom. I also think, I've heard some really great ideas from educators about how to manage this in ways that are new and innovative, and looking at how it's done in other places around the world. We've said from the very beginning we're learning from other countries and how they've done things, and countries like Denmark and Finland and how they have done it. Early on, we looked a lot to New Zealand. New Zealand is in a different situation we are in terms of transmission of COVID. But we've learned from around the world different ways of being able to do this depending on the age, depending on the classroom and the sizes. And so we think this is a reasonable approach. Having said that, it is going to take some adjustment. We're all going to have to continue to be patient and flexible and calm, and we will make our way through this. And I don't know if you want to add to that.
Do you have a follow-up, Richard?
I do. What do you say to parents who are looking at this plan and, as you mentioned, feel anxious and don't want to send their kids back to school, or are concerned about expanding their bubbles? And to those who are worried about the other activities they have, dance classes, extracurriculars, can they still do those if they send their kids back to school?
This is going to be, again, as we have all along, a little bit of understanding your own situation and who you may be putting at risk. So yes, when children go back to school, we will have more contacts. We want to make sure those contacts are done in a safe manner. So maintaining physical distance, the hand hygiene, the smaller numbers of contacts in a school setting compared to what would have been before. But if I have elderly parents who are living with me, then we may want to do the trade-off, where some of the extracurricular activities are scaled back for the fall. So those are the things that each family has to think through. Do you want to add to that?
Next question is from Andrea Wu, Globe and Mail.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I just wanted to make sure that I understood. Dr. Henry, did you say that while students will be in these separated learning groups, they will still have an opportunity to socialize in common spaces like hallways, playgrounds, etc.?
Within their learning groups, yes. So the idea is to manage bell times and lunch times and schedules so that you minimize the interaction with any other learning group. So that way we keep the pods or the learning groups small. That is a very effective way of reducing potential for transmission. But there will be some cases, things like on school buses, for example, where that may not be possible, and the focus will be on ensuring physical distances and masking if needed.
Do you have a follow-up, Andrea?
Yeah, and I was also wondering how substitute teachers and on-call teachers will factor into this.
Yeah, so, those will be on and I'm probably not the best to answer that, but it will be dependent on the group and trying to minimize the movement of those teachers between groups and between learning groups. Maybe you could answer that.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Andrea. And there is a reference to this in the new health and safety guidelines around those who are temporarily part of a learning group and how that can best be managed, and what additional measures are taken to ensure that can be done safely, just as there are for students who may temporarily be in a situation that's outside of their learning group. There are a number of requirements in the guidelines.
Next question is from Shannon Patterson, CTV.
Oh, hi there. I'm trying to understand the cohort situation. I'm just going to use my own example as I have a daughter in grade 12 who has 8 different classes. And so she may be in a cohort of 120, but won't she see a bunch of different students in her classes that aren't part of her cohort? How does the cohort help if students are still in class with a bunch of other different students?
Yeah. So I don't know if your daughter goes to a school where there's a full year school term and a sort of rotating 5-day with 8 course blocks, or a semester, or as we've seen, some districts are moving to a quarterly semester system. You know, we've announced today that we're going to have to look at high school scheduling. There's no doubt about it. There's going to be some work to do that. But the concept of 120 is that that's roughly about 4 classes, including teachers and support staff that may work with students. You stay in that learning group. So, you know, course subjects, even some electives will be organized within that 120 group, student learning group. And you stay with them, for example, in a semester system, and then you may be in a different learning cohort when the next semester begins again. So those are kind of the foundational principles around the learning group model in the health and safety guidelines. And I'll just ask Stephanie to, yeah.
So I think the idea of the learning groups is very different, and we kind of have to shake out of our heads how we're used to seeing schools organized, because if we keep trying to stick a square peg into a round hole, it's not going to fit. So, you know, in order for folks to be able to conceptualize this, we really have to kind of have, you know, erase everything from the chalkboard and start again, and think about different ways of being in the school. And I think one of the things that's in the health and safety guidelines is that if a student has an elective that's outside of their learning group, they can then take that elective as long as social distancing can be observed in that elective. So that might include things like band or choral music or drama, where you could use a bigger space, and it might mean we have to use the spaces within our schools differently than we're used to doing. So if schools are used to working on a linear model, which I think is what you're talking about, Shannon, where your daughter was taking 8 courses at once, they may have to talk about going to a semestered system. Or I've seen some districts already talking about going to a quarter semester system, where students are taking even just 2 courses at once for a shorter period of time. So it's going to take a little while for districts to think about the ways that they can implement this in the best way that meets the needs of their communities. But it's also going to require all of us who interact with the school system to kind of take a step back and not try to think about the way that schools were organized traditionally, and allow people to have some space to think outside the box and be innovative with how we group students together.
Do you have a follow-up, Shannon?
I do. What is the protocol if a child or a teacher tests positive for COVID-19? Will parents be alerted? Will everyone in that class automatically be tested for COVID or be asked to self-isolate?
It will depend, and public health will be part of that. So we do have protocols for it depends on where the source of infection was, whether it was in the school setting or not. So it depends on the investigation that's done by public health. But, you know, the worst case scenario would be that entire cohort would be asked to self-isolate and be monitored and tested. That would be sort of the extent of it, and why we've gone to this cohort system, because that's how we could manage it effectively. If it happens, as we've seen in other settings, where the exposure event was outside of the school setting, then that individual may be removed from the setting. But if they weren't sick in the school, then it may not have an impact on the other people in the cohort. So it really depends on the situation. And yes, public health will be working closely. Our medical health officers are the school health officers, and they do have relationships across the province with schools, and they will be ensuring that the school community is informed and kept up to date on everything that's happening.
Next question is from Zara Premji, CBC.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I think this is going to be for Minister Flemming. So what sorts of aids will be given to those teachers who are feeling uncertain about returning to the classroom, and basically they don't want to, but their livelihood now depends on it?
Right. A couple of things. I mean, one is we recognize that a substantive announcement like this, giving overall direction and a new health and safety protocol, will take some time to digest. Teachers are represented by local teachers associations and their union. We'll continue to work with them to provide answers to the questions that they undoubtedly will have. I think the more they familiarize themselves with some of the details around the protections that are being put in place, and the experience we've had in June to guide some of that work, the better they'll feel. And I think the reality is that British Columbia, as was mentioned earlier, has done an incredible job reducing COVID transmission everywhere in the province. Very different in other jurisdictions where that is not the case. You've heard Dr. Henry talk about how we have to have a safe, responsible summer to allow for the strongest restart to school possible come September 8th, and that's the most critically important thing for us. But within the school, there are a number of barriers around reducing COVID transmission to protect students and staff. We have certainly listened to teachers around some of them having a preference for masks and even face shields as part of how they would like to work in a school. We'll continue to listen to ideas that teachers might have as they digest the new guidelines, and we'll keep working with them.
Do you have a follow-up, Zara?
Yes, please. So for those students now not comfortable in returning or perhaps are even immunocompromised, how will their education be maintained if teachers are in the classroom? Now are they going to have to self-direct because they're not going to have that online learning if their teacher is teaching?
So for an immunocompromised student, we will have some specific guidelines about that from the BC Centre for Disease Control shortly. As was the case in May, parents will need to take their child to their family doctor and work with the school community about what a learning plan might look like for that student. In some cases where they're truly immunocompromised, it is best for them to learn in an alternate environment. It could be within a school that's an isolated space. It could be at home. Look, we're mindful of making accommodations for students. It's critically important for us to connect all students in British Columbia, no matter what their circumstances are, to a return to learning this fall and this next school year.
Next question is from Lisa Euston, News 1130.
Hi there, Dr. Henry and Minister Flemming. You mentioned, Dr. Henry, or maybe Minister Flemming did, about music returning, choral band, or maybe it was Stephanie, I'm not sure who. But how is that going to work when we know that singing is one of the places that, spit spreads, essentially? So I'm wondering, how will things like that work in drama when kids are moving around? How will that work within this situation?
Yeah, those are things that we're continuing to follow. There's a lot that can be done in small groups with distancing, particularly outside. And so those are the things that individual schools will have to look at. So it may not be possible to offer it everywhere, but we want people to look at. Some students only learn, or an important part of their learning is through music or sports. So we need to have some of those opportunities available for children, but it needs to be done in a way that minimizes any risks. And taking things outside is one way of doing it. There are other options as well, having a bigger space, smaller numbers, making sure equipment's not being shared. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at.
Do you have a follow-up, Lisa?
Yes, I do. I'm wondering what kind of screening process there's going to be for students and teachers arriving during the day, and just how people can wrap their heads around their kids being around 60 or 120 students, and for that matter, the teachers and staff, when right now, we're being told that we can only have 6 people when we go out for dinner. It just seems so much to wrap our heads around.
Yeah. So this, I think we need to think of it more like a workplace where we take precautions, but we have our work bubble as well, and we make sure that we're not having contact as much as possible, but also reducing the numbers of people that we're encountering. So it is a balancing, and we've said that all along. It's trying to find a mix that allows for the important social interactions that are needed in the school setting, but minimizing risks of transmission. So that's how we're going to be going through this. And I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of what you said already. Did you want to repeat that?
Ensuring people aren't there sick.
Oh, right, the screening people. Yeah, so this was something that was started in June and is actually quite effective. So it's basically parents or students and themselves, all staff, every day attesting, going through that list of potential symptoms and being sure that they don't have those, and children being screened for symptoms, asked if they're okay, if they're feeling well when they enter the school every day, minimizing the people who are coming into the school, so parents wouldn't be taking their children into the school, making sure that we have the learning cohorts being the group of people that people have contact with. Very similar to what we're doing, for example, in the healthcare settings, where we're reducing visitors, reducing the number of people who are actually physically in the setting as well. So there will be a screening process every day for everybody who's going into the school system.
We have time for one more question, and that is from Keith Baldry, Global News.
Hi, Dr. Henry, Minister Flemming. Just going to pass on some questions getting from social media. I assume if you're just sticking to your learning group, that inter-school sports are off the table. Is that a correct reading of that?
We will be, essentially, yes. We will be looking at, ways of, like we're doing through the summer, where local teams can play each other in a certain way. But yes, no, there'll be no tournaments, there'll be no assemblies, there'll be no large group gatherings where people from outside areas would be coming together. Didn't you want to add to that?
A follow-up, Keith?
Yes, just received some notes from parents of immune-compromised children who have serious underlying health conditions, basically who did not attend school in June. They sat that one out. What is the advice for them in terms of what they should be doing?
Yeah, so I think every individual child needs to be assessed with their physician. We can't blanket say. It depends on what the immune condition is. And yes, they need to both work with their medical team, but also with their school team to make sure they get the appropriate learning plan for them. And as Minister Flemming said, that might be in school setting, it might be in a home setting, depending on the situation, the individual situation. Can
I just add something to that?
Sure, please.
Just from an operational perspective at the local school district level, I think it's important for folks to remember that we've always had immune-compromised children. What we have now is perhaps another layer and another category of them. So school districts have always had processes and protocols in place to ensure that they could accommodate their immunocompromised children. And so those processes will continue, and perhaps we will have to increase staffing or increase the accommodations that we provide to those students. So it's important to remember that we've always had immunocompromised children. We will continue to have those processes and protocols in place. We'll just have to ramp them up a little bit during this process.
That's all the time we have. Thank you.